The M1 Pro and M1 Max are here, and they're actually really, really cooler than I think I've even mentioned. Like, I've talked about how evolutionary this chip is, and I didn't want to tell you just by myself, because to be honest, I'm just going to tell you, if you're a professional, go buy it. If you're not, don't. But there's a bit of gray here. There's a bunch of things going on, and I didn't think that I could do it alone. So I decided to bring in my good friend, Rene Ritchie, to help me talk about the newest M1 series of SoCs.
Right after this.
This is, you listening to Travis.
Welcome back, everybody. Listen, we're going to do this. We're just going to jump right in. We're going to talk about the M1 Pro, the M1 Max. I want to, before we even get into that, let me just, there's a big elephant in the room. Let's just kill this right up front, because everyone always brings it up in the comments, the notch. I'm going to give my 2 cents about the notch. You can give your 2 cents, and we can move on and never speak of this again, because it's a big bunch of nothing as far as I'm concerned. It is okay. For the first time, a notch on a laptop is definitely kind of a new thing to get used to. But as Greg kind of pointed out when we were doing a live reaction, that particular top part of the screen is not even really used. It looks like there's some software tricks that Apple's going to use to actually just make it part of where the bar is, the top bar is. So it's kind of irrelevant. My only thought is they didn't have to do a notch, though, right? Because they don't have the Face ID technology in there.
Yeah, I think their idea was just like they could have done a forehead like they've always done before, but why not just move the menu bar out of the way, like get it out of that screen real estate? And by doing this, like all those things would just be dead atoms. It wouldn't be anything. Now your menu bar is tucked under there, and the entire display is for your content.
I mean, at this point, you're getting more screen real estate anyway, so again, it's kind of a moot point. It's, you could say, well, I'd rather not have the notch. Well, you would have less screen real estate. So I guess, the trade-off is fair. So I mean, it is going to be weird for a lot of people. And I actually made a prediction that we might start seeing Windows laptops with a notch. What do you think?
I think like if you could take the quick notes and just kind of put them underneath the notch for safekeeping, just kind of tuck them under there, I think that'd be really useful.
It's a great place to put your sticky notes if you don't like to have a webcam looking at you every day. Anyway, okay, so the M1 Pro and M1 Max that have just been announced, they are, of course, the newer kind of evolution of the M1. It's not the M2. What exactly is the big kind of takeaway from this? We'll dive into the bits and pieces, but if someone was in an elevator and were like, okay, Rene, what's the big deal with the Pro and the Max? Why should I care?
Yeah, so I mean, just to address your first point, it's not an M2 because this is still based on the A14 generation silicon, the same silicon we saw in the M1. The Ice Storm efficiency cores are the same. The Firestorm performance cores are the same. The G13 graphics cores are the same. So it's all the same compute units that we had in the M1. There is just more of them, massively more of them, and then all the associated technologies that you need, because you can't just throw more cores in and call it a day. It's like adding a bunch more cars to the road and saying you're calling it a day. They have to build all the infrastructure to make those work. So what you've basically got is the M1 just scaled up, massively scaled up in the Max sense. So like you have 1.5 to 2 M1s in the M1 Pro, and then 2 to 3 M1s in the M1 Max.
And the M1 made a huge splash last year as Apple really kind of staked their claim in a business that you would think they wouldn't be able to move the needle, but so much so, and I mentioned this last year, that Intel really just went nuts, and Microsoft as well, making commercials about a competitor that's not even really in their space, which was so weird to see. But I think it really proved the point that, when we saw the M1 originally get announced and they had all these kind of, not benchmarks, but like they're saying that it can do all these things, and there was a lot of, can it really? And we later found out that it really could. Shaking the industry is kind of an understatement. What do you think these are going to do as far as like AMD and Intel?
They're solving a different problem space. And one of the issues is laptops they're portables. But if you look at Intel and AMD, their bread and butter are server chips. Like they make so much money off enterprise clients. And they've been trying for years to take those massive chips and just shrink them down and get them into laptops. But laptops are so thermally constrained and they're so power constrained, where Apple had to solve for performance in an iPhone. And that is like the peak of very small thermal envelope and very small battery, and the need to have a really high level of performance efficiency. And so they had to just scale up. So where Intel and AMD have had to like try to cram everything down, Apple's like, wow, look at all the space we have now. And it turns out if you take advantage of that, what worked really great, what gave them what they call desktop class performance in a phone, once you give it the breathing room of an iPad and then of a Mac, those things can fly. Like it's a whole different architecture. Traditionally, AMD and Intel were like a hose. You know, how much water can we put through this hose at what high pressure? And Apple's approach was, we don't really need a hose. We're going to do a river. You know, rivers are wide. They're kind of slow, but because they're just so wide, we can throw so much pressure behind it. And it's a completely different approach, but it's working really well in especially power constrained environments.
For the people that just bought a M1 MacBook Pro, and are in the comments, at least of my videos, saying, "Oh, should I not have gotten this?" I tried to point out that this particular version of MacBook Pro is not really the same thing, or even to the same target audience as the other. Can you quickly help explain, besides the screen size, like why that MacBook Pro is not the same MacBook Pro we're seeing today?
Yeah, so basically it's about removing constraints. The whole point of a MacBook Pro is to see if you can do what you'd otherwise do on a desktop, like on a Mac Mini or an iMac. And so the cores are the same. You'll get the same performance for single core. Anything that's single core bound, you're going to get the exact same performance because they're the same cores. I mean, maybe they're a little bit, you know, they've teased a little bit more frequency out of it, but more or less you'll get the same performance. What these do is just there's massively more cores. You know, there's 8 performance cores instead of 4, and there's up to 32 graphics cores instead of just 4 of them in the M1. So you can do like massively multi-core workloads much better, and that's like just doing multiple things or throwing a ton of GPUs behind rendering. So if you have a workload that you feel like you're not getting, and that includes like you don't have enough RAM, you don't have enough SSD, you don't have enough GPU cores, you don't have enough performance cores, if you feel like you're being limited by the hardware, then it will improve your life to get this. But if you've been fine on an M1 MacBook Pro, even an M1 MacBook Air, this is just like, it's like getting the Cadillac version.
One of the things that's kind of hard to explain to a lot of people who watch some of these videos is why this is so impressive. And the M1, since its inception, has been impressive, but this is even more kind of mind melting with the amount of data they're able to push through this SoC. Not only that, but like, the power efficiency is on a scale that you just have to know that AMD and Intel, the leadership there must have been watching with their mouths wide open. Let's take a look at like why these things are so efficient and what that really means to the end user. Why is it such a big deal? Number one, let's talk a little bit about the fact that these work the same plugged in as they do when they're not plugged in, which is a huge differentiator when you're talking about Windows laptops.
Yeah, I mean, it's that wide, slow, low architecture where they don't have to run things very fast or very hot. They're just doing it in incredible volume so they can move through these workloads. So we look at like the i9 16-inch MacBook Pro. That thing is a space heater. Like it's essentially a space heater in a box. And Apple doesn't have to do that. And they have advantages, like they use a unified memory architecture. So traditionally, I like to describe it like traditionally you have a charcuterie plate or like a buffet where your CPU is over here, your RAM's over there, your GPU is over here, the VRAM for the GPU. And it's like everything is spread out and you got to keep reaching for all these parts, which isn't efficient. You got to like stack all this stuff yourself. Where Apple's using a system on chip and a package architecture. So all of this memory is on the same package. And that means you're not copying back and forth between the CPU and the GPU. But it also means, like, I think the maximum I've ever seen on a laptop, really high laptop, is like 16 gigabytes of VRAM. And here you have, like, you can go up to like 32 gigabytes of VRAM, 64 gigabytes of RAM that can feed those GPUs. So you can just do things that you've never been able to do on a laptop.
It's really kind of mind numbing. Like, how is that possible? One of the first things I saw in my comment section started to pop up a lot was, with all this new GPU power, we're going to be able to see some gaming on these. Now, again, I wouldn't buy one of these for gaming, but I mean, the question is asked now. I mean, some of the graphs we saw and some of the comparisons they made to high-end laptops were obviously laptops that would be used for gaming. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's still a few issues here. Like, this is like a ton of power. It's like having a brand new electric car that doesn't work with any of the common charging stations, you know? So the game developers still have to make games for this. And Apple and NVIDIA, for example, they have such different worldviews because they're both very successful and very arrogant companies. So like NVIDIA believes that the graphics card should be the most important thing, and the PC is like this commodity box that basically you just plug the GPU into, and everybody should be using their big CUDA cores. Where Apple thinks that the Mac is the important part, surprise, surprise, and that the graphics should be commodity, and they should be able to plug in any graphics, and Metal is this abstraction layer. Their Metal interface will just handle anything that you write for it. And those are very conflicted worldviews. So anybody who wants those like software that's dependent on CUDA cores probably won't be happy unless that software is ported over. And all of people who want games, those game companies have to see value and have to see a reason to pay the money, to like pay it forward to bring all those games to the Mac. So I wouldn't buy it just because the graphics are performing well. The software, including games that you need, have to be on it for it to be valuable to you.
Now, what do you think? I saw your reaction video where you talked a little bit about some of the scales they use to show the performance difference between this and Windows. And, you know, Apple's not the only one that does this, but Apple does it pretty well, where the numbers are really, really, really impressive. What is your immediate thought? Do you immediately think best case scenario? Or are you thinking that they're maybe picking and choosing to make something look a little bit better than it is? Or what do you think?
No, I think it's worse than that in a way. I think it's like they just don't want to put the footnote on the screen the way other vendors do, because they think it'll look messy on top of their beautiful keynote, which annoys me because I want to see it. And like if you look at those graphs and like very tiny print at the bottom of the graphs, it'll say it's like the MSI, or it'll be like what they've named the laptops, the ASUS like laptops that they're doing, but you can't really see it in the show. You got to go there afterwards. And I think they were like a little bit of retribution, because if you look at the footnotes list, it's like 9 pages of footnotes on what they tested for this. Like, you people want footnotes? Here are your footnotes. It's like an hour to read through them, but like you can find those machines. And Dave 2D put up a video where he's like, I have these machines here. I don't know if I can believe what they're saying, because these machines are the most powerful machines I've ever tested, and they like smoke them like on performance efficiency and get very close to smoking them on performance when they're plugged in, never mind when they're off power.
If you look at that chart, the M1 Max is in between the performance of these two laptops. And as someone who's very familiar with these laptops, I've done reviews on both of them, I understand how powerful these things are. They're really good. They're some of the best that Windows laptops have to offer right now. This one on the bottom is the best. I labeled my video on this, my review of it, the fastest, because it is the fastest. But to see M1X come in between these at 55 watts is incredible. It makes me look at these products in a completely different light, because if those charts are true, and Tim Cook is saying no cap, this is a game-changing moment for high-performance laptops.
Well, so this is the same thing that happened to Linus last year, and the trappings of not believing Apple when Apple does, I think, if nothing else, I mean, they're great at their mastery at marketing, but they've been pretty truthful. And if you think about like their battery claims, they've always been really accurate, and sometimes even under what you actually get out of it. And with the M1 kind of doing the same thing, and where there was a lot of like criticism and like, is this really the thing? And it was, I absolutely believe whatever these numbers are. Like, they've earned my trust in this particular regard, which makes it mind numbing, which makes me want to watch people like Linus and Dave 2D kind of take these through the ringer. What are your expectations here? Do you think they're going to find that the performance is as good as Apple says, or do you think it's going to be somewhere in the middle? What are your expectations?
Yeah, I think Apple learned to be conservative just because they have such a huge target on them every time they release anything, and anytime there is an issue with something, they just get hammered on it, that they've learned to sort of under-promise and over-deliver. Now, some of the numbers are for like idealized circumstances. Like when you look at 21 hours of battery life on a 16-inch MacBook Pro, that's watching streaming video, which is handled by a dedicated H.265, an HEVC encode decode block. So that is incredibly efficient. That's like an ideal case for battery life. And if you're like rendering Final Cut Pro, your battery life is going to be way less than that. It'll still be more than any other laptop, but it'll be way less than that. So a lot of this is going to be highly workload dependent. Same thing, like if you're using the SoC, if you're firing the CPU cores and the GPU cores, it'll be good. If you find some way to fire like every bit of silicon on that chip, then you're going to start having these heavy workloads. So I think for most people, it'll just be, again, more. You'll have more of whatever your previous workload was.
So what do we think the impact is of this on the industry at large is going to be? Obviously, the M1 allowed Apple to move away from Intel for a lot of their hardware. We're kind of still in the transition period, but we're almost completely out of the transition period at this point. We heard the Intel CEO talk about how he wanted to woo Apple back, but after a presentation like this, I mean, it looks like they have bigger problems than that. How do you think the other chip manufacturers are going to react to this?
Yeah, well, I think Intel, maybe they have a shot as a foundry if they can prove, like everybody wants to have foundries that are more geographically diverse. It's just better for everybody, for everything from natural disasters to geopolitical realities. Just being able to have chips fabbed in different parts of the world would be great. But I think Intel is in more trouble because they've had so many struggles. And also, Intel only really makes the CPU. They have Iris integrated graphics, but they're not spectacular. AMD makes really, really good products. And their APUs, they're conceivably in a really good position. They might have to re-architect, for the portable devices, the kind that Apple is really doing well at, but they have all the elements to it. So does Qualcomm. But their issue is that Apple basically snapped their fingers and the Mac was on ARM. Like there was a very, very small transition period. Some software took longer than others, but all of Mac OS and all of Apple's native apps and a surprising amount of third-party apps. And if you wrote for Metal, the Rosetta apps worked better in emulation than they worked on native Intel Macs. And Microsoft has really struggled to deliver a compelling Windows experience. So like Qualcomm would be really well suited to compete against this too, but just they're hamstrung in a way by Windows on ARM.
Speaking of making your own processors, obviously we have Google that just came out with their Pixel 6 and Pixel 6 Pro on their new architecture, where they kind of had a little slick shot in the thing in their presentation, talking about how they were hamstrung for a couple of years, not being able to do the things they wanted to do. So they had to make their own chip, kind of like what Apple has been saying this entire time. Yeah. Is this a good strategy moving forward? I mean, some people might say, well, Samsung should do it next, although they've been doing it for years and just not doing it well. What do you think about Google taking kind of the same path as Apple in this particular regard?
I love it, but I'm also super concerned because the one thing Google hasn't shown is a consistent strategy. Apple's advantage, like what people think Apple's boring, and that's totally legitimate. But one of the reasons they're boring is because they incrementally improve every year. They start with something and they make it a little bit better every year. Where like if you look at every Pixel phone, they're basically a repudiation of the previous device. They don't take the previous Pixel and make it better. They're like, that was all wrong. We're doing it different this year. But every year, like Pixel 1 and 2 were an exception. But like since then, and that means that they're not really building on anything every year. They're almost starting over in a way. And it's the same thing. They had that photo processing unit, the Pixel Core, that they just got rid of, and they fired that whole team, and they got another whole team. And like it took Apple 10 years to get to the point where they could start doing this. And I think Google could absolutely do this, but they need to give themselves time. They can't just keep spinning on a dime every year, because you end up like running around the mountain rather than running up the mountain. And I think like the Tensor Core is great, but it's mostly Samsung Exynos in there. Like they were very careful with their wording. We have a custom Tensor TPU, basically a neural engine. We have a custom Titan security chip, basically a secure enclave. And then we carefully selected the CPU and GPU. And that's just like, those are Samsung Exynos cores and Mali GPUs. And we've seen what Exynos does before. And we've seen the leaked Geekbench. So like, I think it's fantastic if this is the starting point, if this is their A4 and they spend the next 5 years making a fully custom chipset that blows us away. That would make me super happy.
Yeah, that's definitely one thing that people aren't taking into consideration, is that the M1 series of SoCs are really just the evolution of the A series that eventually kind of became this. It's not something they just came out with 2 years ago and it came out of nowhere. This has been a constant kind of reevaluation of what worked, what didn't work, and continuing to hone down until they got to where they are today. And Google, this is essentially their first. You're right, they're A4 in a really interesting way. That's a really interesting way to putting that. I know you're excited to get yours. Tell me what do you spec'd out and what you got, because I'm real curious, and tell us how much it costs, because we all love to know that.
So I went the MacBook route. I've been waiting for this for 10 years. And I went back and forth on MacBook Airs and MacBook Pros on 13-inch and 15-inch. I started off on a 17-inch. That went away. So like I've been going back and forth between portability and performance, because we would be at events and you have to render stuff quick, but like you have to carry it around with you too. So there's all these trade-offs. But this time I decided I'm going to buy this. I typically keep my MacBook Pros for like 3 to 5 years. And even then I hand it down. Like most of my family has Macs of mine that are up to 10 years old and still work great. So for me, they're long-term investments. So I maxed it out, assuming that we're going to be able to start traveling again when the world stops ending. So I went with like the 64 gigabytes of RAM, the 8 terabytes of SSD, the 16 inch display, and it's Canadian dollars, so it's a lot. Like I don't know what it is in American. It's probably like 6,000 American, I figure. Mm-hmm. In Canadian dollars, it's like, I don't know, 3 million.
Oh my god. So what does this mean for M2? Is it going to be? I mean, can it get any better? I guess the last thought of this is M2 isn't all that far off. I mean, I know that we're just doing M1 Pro and M1, but you got to remember this is something that we actually kind of expected earlier in the year. Do you think the cycle has shifted kind of weirdly now, where we might see the M2 as a quick turnaround, or do you think they're just going to delay everything to make it last as long as possible?
So I think Apple thinks about it in a fundamentally different way than a lot of people, like a lot of us on the internet do, where we're sort of preoccupied with like what has to come in chronological order and what makes sense. And they're more practical. They're like, what fulfills the requirement to make this a good product? And the performance is one thing. Like a lot of people got caught up in, oh, Geekbench says the A15 is only 10% faster than the A14. And like Geekbench is all right, but it's not like a substantive benchmark. Like you need an Antec to dig in there. And they're like, yeah, guess what? It's 10% faster, but it's also drawing way less power. It's way cooler. It can sustain for longer. Plus the small cores, the efficiency cores are like 30% faster. And the GPUs are redonkulously faster, but also they're doing ProRes encode decode off of the, because that used to be CPU and GPU bound. They're doing that off the CPU and GPU now. And I think one of the interesting things with Apple is that they're realizing the big core is going to take you so far, because eventually you're going to hit physics, like the size of the thermal envelope and your ability to spike a small battery, which will brown it out. So like you're always going to be encumbered by the size and the power draw. And you can move a lot of stuff off those big cores so that you can do them efficiently. And yeah, it adds complexity. But if you're Apple, I don't think you really care at this point. It's like 57 billion transistors in that M1 Max chip. Apple doesn't do like the X series every year. There was no A13X. There was no A11X. So it's possible we won't get an M2 based M2 Pro and an M2 Max. We may not, but like Apple will figure out what the advantage is. And I think for like the M2 is rumored for the MacBook Air. It's going to be a next generation ultra low power processor. And the A15 is ideally suited for that, because instead of like Ice Storm and Firestorm, they have Avalanche and Blizzard. It's like doubling down on the cold. It's no longer like a Song of Fire and Ice. It's like winter has come. It's like the double the cache, everything you need to get that performance with even greater efficiency, which is ideally suited. May not even make a difference on a MacBook Pro, but on a MacBook Air, if you can get like 10% better peak performance, but you can do it for much longer with way better battery life, like we're seeing with the iPhone 13, that's a huge win for a MacBook Air. So I think we're not going to see like the traditional sort of generational improvements, but we'll see very specific improvements for whatever products they want to make.
Well, look, if you guys want more information about the M series of MacBook Pros, Pro Max, heck, I mean, even if you missed the iPhone 13 Pro and Pro Max coverage that Rene did, I'll leave a link to his channel in the description below. Of course, if you're a fan of GadgetCast, you've heard Rene tons of times. We love him on GadgetCast. And I think that just leaves us with one thing to say, Rene. We just got to make sure we cancel Greg.
Yes. I like Greg, though.
I mean, he's all right. I'll see you guys next time. Peace and love.